Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can read data from an API and output a weather app depending on where a user has inputted. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is come over to weatherapi.com and sign up and get your own API key. Next we will come over to Terminal. I've created a folder and I've CD'd into the folder. I will just make sure that I don't have any virtual environments running because we're going to create our own. So we'll say Python 3-m vmv and we'll say myenv. And then once that is done, we are going to activate it by source bin myenv bin activate. And then we're just going to install Flask and requests. So whilst this is happening, if we come over to Visual Studio Code, inside here we will create a templates and a static, and then we'll just have an app.py, and then in our templates we'll say index.html, and in our static we will say styles.css. So the first thing that we're going to do is just create a little bit of logic to actually handle the API call. So we'll say from Flask, import Flask, render template, request, and JSONify. And then we are also going to import the requests library. So now let's just make sure that's done. Yes, that is. So here we will say app is equal to Flask, and then name. And then at the bottom of the file, we are just going to say if name is double equal to main, app.run, and we'll pass in debug is equal to true. So now, just to make sure that everything is up and running correctly, we'll create a root, and we'll say def index for the function, and we're just going to return render template of index.html. So in here, we'll just create a heading 1 and we'll say hello world. So now if we come back over to our terminal, say Python 3 app.py, we have a working localhost link, which we can now come over to Google and open, and we have this working correctly. So now if we come back to Visual Studio Code, we're going to use our API key. So at the top, we'll create a constant called API key, and then we're just going to get that from this weather app. So we'll copy this and come back over to here, and that didn't work. We are going to copy this and paste it in. Okay, so we now have our API key stored in a constant. And we'll just create a function that is going to get the weather. So we'll say def get weather, and we want to pass in a city. So now we'll create a base URL, and this will just link to the endpoint from the WeatherAPI. So api.weatherapi.com, and we'll say /v1, and then current.json, and that will get the weather for the current place. So now we want to pass in some parameters. The key is going to be API key, and then the query is going to be the city variable that we pass in when we actually run this. So we'll say try response is equal to requests.get, and then pass in the base URL with the params. And then we'll say response.raise for status. So now if everything has worked correctly, we are going to say data.response.json. And then here we'll say weather, and we're going to create a dictionary, or essentially a JSON variable. So city, and we'll say data at location, and then name. We're then going to say temperature, data current, and then we'll say temp_Celsius. We'll then say description, so the data current condition in text, and then we are looking for the humidity, and this will be data current and then humidity. And finally the pressure, so data current pressure underscore MB, and then we are going to return the weather. So this is going to loop or look through all of this data that's been returned, and we are going to get the city, the temperature, the description, humidity, and the pressure, and then we're going to return that weather variable. So now outside of this try, we'll say accept requests.exceptions.http error as HTTP error, and then we're just going to say return error HTTP error occurred, and we'll pass in HTTP error, and then accept request.exceptions connection, cannot spell connection, as con error, and we're going to return another dictionary connection error, and we'll just say con error, and then accept requests.exceptions.timeout as timeout error. We're just going to return another one, so we say timeout error, and these are just going to output the actual messages. So then finally we will raise the exception, so request.exceptions request exception as request error, and here we're just going to return error, an error occurred. So this is just covering every single error that we could potentially get back. And this is now our weather function sorted. So now if we come down to here and we create a new route, and this is just going to be for /weather, and we'll pass in a post method. We'll say def weather. We're going to say city is equal to request.form. So in the front end, there will be a form with a input value that has the name of city, and we're going to get whatever the data is that's passed into that form. And then we'll say weather data. And we're going to call that function we've just created above and pass in this city variable that's been passed in from the front end. And then we'll return JSONify weather data. So whether it's this or one of these errors that are returned, it will be returned to the front end in JSON. So now that is our app.py file sorted, we can now head over to our HTML file. So if we create a HTML5 boilerplate, and we'll just say WeatherApp, and then inside of here we are going to link to a Bootstrap CDN so that we can actually use some icons. So we'll say stackpath.bootstrapcdn.com/bootstrap 4.5.2 CSS, and then bootstrap.min.css, and then we'll also do a font awesome CDN, so https cdn.js cloudflare.com AJAX libs font awesome 5.15.4 CSS, and then we'll say all.min.css. And then finally, we are just going to link to a script tag, which will be for jQuery. So here we'll say code.jQuery.com/jQuery 3.6.0.min.js, and that will allow us to use jQuery in this. So now we'll create a container, and we'll say heading 1 with a class of text center, WeatherApp. Don't know how that happened. WeatherApp. And then we'll say form with the ID of weather form. We'll give it a class of form inline and justify content center. And then inside of this form, we are going to create a div for the city and a input, but we can actually remove this action variable. So we'll say div form group, and we'll give it a margin bottom of 2. And then we'll say label for city, and then we'll say city, and then input text with a name of city and a class of form control, and we'll also give it an ID of city. Now outside of this div, we will create a button with a type of submit, and we'll say class btn primary, margin bottom 2 and margin left 2, and get weather. So now we have this form. If we come back to here and just make sure that everything is running, request exception error as request. Because I put a colon there. So now if I come back to here and refresh, that's working. So if we come here and refresh this page, we now have a form with a label and a button. So now coming back to Visual Studio Code, if we come on to the index.html again, we're just going to have a way to output all the information. So we'll say div ID weather result. We'll say class text center, and then inside of this, heading 2 with weather details, and then div.weather info. We'll then use the I, and we'll say class FAS FA city, and this will grab the icon that we want. So we'll say span with the ID city name, and then if we copy this and we paste it 1, 2, 3, 4 times, so the next one, instead of city name, will be temperature, and we'll change this to be FA thermometer, and we'll add half to the end just so it's half full. And then we'll change this one to be description, and we'll say FA cloud. This will be changed to humidity, and then FA tint, and this will be changed to pressure, and we'll say FA dot tachometer, and we'll grab the alternative one. So now if we come back into Google Chrome and we refresh, we now have some icons that will be outputting the actual data next to it. So now coming back to Google Chrome, we'll add a little bit more styling. So just inside the head, we'll add style tags, and we'll just say body, padding 20 pixels, weather result, say margin top of 20 pixels, and then all the weather info classes can have a margin top of 10 pixels. So now at the bottom of this file, we can start using some JavaScript to actually work for the outputting of the data and converting this JSON variable of all of this into front-end text. So we'll say inside of script tags, $document. So once the document is ready, we are going to add this function. So we'll say inside of this weather form. So once the weather form is submitted, so this is an event listener for the submit of this form up here. We're going to create a function, and we'll pass in event just so that we can actually handle the event. And we'll say event.prevent default. So this will stop the form actually being submitted because we don't want it to actually go anywhere. So we'll now create a new variable, and this is going to be targeting the city, so the input value of city, and we'll just say val. And now we want to use some AJAX. So this AJAX is then going to call this function. Essentially, it will essentially head over to the weather. It will pass in this city value and then output or return this JSON variable. So here we'll say type, and here post URL, and we're going to pass in /weather, and then the data will be a JSON variable of city, and the value will be this city value here. So now we want to create a success and then a function for it. So we're going to return the data, which is this data here. So we'll say if data.error, so if the first thing inside the data variable is error, then we will say weather result, and this needs to be inside of a jQuery variable. We'll say HTML, and we'll just create a p tag that has text danger, and then inside of this we're going to say data.error, and that will output the error message that we have set in these. Otherwise, so else, we'll say city-name, and that will then assign the text to the city, and we'll say data.city, and then we'll say temperature, and we'll get the temperature, data.temperature, and then we'll also add Celsius to the end, and then we'll say description dot text, and then data dot description, and then we'll grab the humidity, data.humidity, and then we'll say percentage on the end, and then we will finally grab the pressure, and we will pass in pressure, data.pressure plus, and then HPA. So now when this is returned, we should be getting all of these variables and outputting the actual values. So now if we come back over to Google Chrome and we refresh, we have a little bit more styling. And if I say Newcastle, get the weather, city Newcastle, temperature 19.5 degrees, sunny, 25% humidity, and then 1018 HPA pressure. So now we can do it again for, say, London, and we'll see it is different. And we'll do it again for Paris, and we can see it changes again. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use Python logic and JavaScript to interact with an API and get data to output in our front end. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos that are coming. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.